a cold December night in 2013, 20-year-old Heather Elvis went on a first date that seemed perfectly ordinary. The young man drove her around to look at Christmas lights, taught her how to drive his manual transmission car, and dropped her off at her apartment just after 1 in the morning. She sent photos to her father and called her roommate to talk about how the evening went. But within hours, Heather would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only her locked car at a boat landing and a trail of phone records that would expose a twisted love triangle. What happened in those early morning hours would become one of South Carolina's most haunting mysteries, a case where jealousy, obsession, and secrets collided with devastating consequences. Heather Elvis was the kind of young woman who lit up a room. Born on June 30th, 1993, in Horry County, South Carolina, she was the older of 2 daughters in the Elvis family. Her parents, Terry and Debbie, raised Heather and her younger sister Morgan in the coastal community near Myrtle Beach. After graduating from St. James High School in 2011, Heather moved into her own apartment in Carolina Forest, sharing it with a roommate named Brianna Warrelman, who everyone called Bri. Heather was working her way through life like so many young people do, holding down jobs as a hostess at the Tilted Kilt in Myrtle Beach and the House of Blues in North Myrtle Beach while studying cosmetology. She had dreams of working in a beauty parlor, and just before Christmas 2013, those dreams were coming true. She had landed a job at a salon in Myrtle Beach and was eagerly looking forward to starting. Friends and family remember her as someone who was moving forward, making plans, building a future. But there was a complication in Heather's life, one that had started innocently enough, but had spiraled into something dark and consuming. In June 2013, Heather noticed Sidney Moorer, a 37-year-old married man who came to the Tilted Kilt to repair kitchen equipment. She even tweeted early that month that she had a taste for men who were older. Sidney was a resident of Socasti, married with children, but that didn't stop what happened next. Heather pointed him out to her roommate Bree at work, and soon her tweets became more explicit. She wrote about the guy who builds things at her job, saying he made her cream herself and that she wanted to drag him into a mop closet. By July 10th, she was tweeting that baby did a bad thing and that she was in way too deep but would get in deeper. What followed was an affair that would consume the late summer and early fall of 2013. According to Sidney, the relationship was primarily confined to September. He would bring Heather coffee and bagels at work, and they talked about her possibly working as a nanny for his children if he and his wife moved to Florida, which they were considering. But affairs have a way of unraveling, and this one came apart in the worst possible way. Late in September, Heather tweeted something that now reads like a premonition. Once upon a time, an angel and a devil fell in love. It did not end well. Shortly after that tweet, Sidney's wife Tammy found out about the affair, and she became very, very angry. What happened next reveals just how toxic the situation had become. According to Bree, Tammy made Sidney call Heather while she listened in. During that call, Sidney tore Heather apart, telling her she was nothing to him, just someone who spread her legs. He made her feel horrible about herself, reducing their entire relationship to something cheap and meaningless. But Tammy didn't stop there. She sent Heather threatening text messages and even sent pictures of herself and Sidney in sexual situations, as if to mark her territory. Tammy also tried to get Heather fired from the Tilted Kilt, calling the restaurant repeatedly and telling them her husband would stop repairing their equipment as long as Heather continued working there. At one point, Heather lost hours at work because they sent her home after Tammy kept calling. To ensure Sidney remained faithful, Tammy took extreme measures. She handcuffed him to their bed every night. She changed his phone password to one only she knew. She accompanied him whenever he left the house. Sidney later said he agreed to all these restrictions to save their marriage. Tammy even made Sidney get her name tattooed above his crotch, a permanent mark of ownership. Despite all this control, Tammy continued to contact Heather. On November 1st, Heather texted back that she was no one Tammy needed to worry about anymore. When Tammy sent a text saying that Dad no longer has his phone, presumably referring to Sidney, Heather responded with just a period. It seemed like Heather was trying to move on, to put this chapter behind her. And she was moving on, By December, Heather had resolved with her roommate to start attending church regularly. She was excited about her new job at the beauty parlor starting just before Christmas. She was trying to build a normal life again. On November 5th, she had even retweeted a joke by comedian Daniel Tosh that seemed to reference what she'd been through. "Hey married fellas, you can either cheat on your wife or murder her, never both. That's when you get caught." It was dark humor, but it suggested she was processing what had happened and moving forward. The Moores had left for a vacation to Disney World on November 19th and returned on December 11th. By then, Heather seemed to be in a better place emotionally. On the evening of December 17th, Heather went on that first date with Stephen Schiraldi. They started at 10 in the evening, driving around looking at Christmas lights in the area. Later, they went to the parking lot of Inlet Square Mall, where he taught her how to drive his manual transmission car. She was having fun, sending photos to her dad and to Bree. Stephen dropped her off at her apartment around 1:15 in the morning. He would be the last person known to have seen Heather Elvis alive. What happened in the hours that followed would become the subject of intense investigation, multiple trials, and endless speculation. 20 minutes after Stephen dropped her off at 1:35 in the morning, a call was placed from a payphone to Heather's cell phone. The call lasted 5 minutes. Shortly after that, Heather called Bree, who was out of state visiting family for the holidays. Heather was hysterical. She told Bree that Sidney had called, saying he was planning to leave his wife and he wanted to meet her. Bree, who had been advising Heather to stay away from Sidney, told her not to do anything rash and to get some sleep. The call lasted about 2 minutes before it ended. That conversation would be the last time anyone who cared about Heather would hear her voice. But Heather's phone remained active for hours after that call, and what those phone records reveal is chilling. At 2:30 in the morning, a call was made from Heather's phone to the payphone that had called her earlier, but no one answered. Shortly after, the phone was taken to Longbeard's Bar and Grill in Carolina Forest, where it remained for 15 minutes. Then it traveled as far as Augusta Plantation Drive, roughly 4 miles away, before returning to Longbeard's for another 15 minutes. During this time, a call was placed to Sidney's cell phone, but it wasn't answered. The phone appeared to be in motion again, suggesting it had left Longbeard's. Within 5 minutes, it was back at Heather's apartment, where it remained for another 5 minutes. During that time, it called Sidney's phone again. Sidney's phone was at his home. They had a 4-minute conversation. At 3:37 in the morning, about 8 minutes after that call ended, Heather's phone was taken to Peachtree Landing, a boat launch along the Waccamaw River in Socastee. 1 minute later, 3 attempts were made to call Sidney's phone within 2 minutes. All went unanswered. At 3:41, another attempt was made. A minute and a half later, all data records for Heather's phone ended. Its last known location was somewhere in the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge. Heather Elvis had disappeared. On the evening of December 19th, Heather's green Dodge Intrepid was found at Peachtree Landing, parked perpendicular to the spaces. The car was locked. When police opened it, Heather's phone, keys, and purse were not inside. Calls to her phone went unanswered. She wasn't at her apartment or either of her jobs. Horry County Police began a missing person investigation. Stephen Schiraldi, the last person known to have seen Heather, was quickly cleared. Searches of the area around the boat landing found nothing. Rescue divers from Coastal Carolina University searched the riverbed down to Winyah Bay, but found no sign of Heather. A set of bones discovered nearby around New Year's Day were later determined to belong to a male. It was as if Heather had simply vanished into thin air. But investigators had those phone records, and they had something else: security camera footage. Video from a Myrtle Beach Walmart showed that at 1:12 in the morning on December 18th, Sidney Moorer entered the store, purchased cigars and a pregnancy test, and left after 7 minutes. Footage from a Kangaroo gas station showed Sidney making a call from the payphone across the street to Heather's cell phone at 1:35 in the morning, the same call that had come in 20 minutes after Stephen dropped Heather off. And there was more. Private security cameras along the 3-mile route between the Moore's house and Peachtree Landing captured a dark Ford F-150 passing toward the landing at 3:36 and 3:39 in the morning. At 3:45 and 3:46, the vehicle returned going the opposite direction. The license plate wasn't clearly visible, but after analysis by the South Carolina Highway Patrol and the FBI, it was determined to be Sydney's truck. The phone records also revealed something interesting about communication between Sydney and Tammy. There had been no communication between them via their phones from November 2nd, the day Sydney surrendered his phone to Tammy, until 3:37 in the morning on December 18th. That's when Tammy sent Sydney a text asking for the pot stickers and orange juice. "Yes, ma'am," he replied immediately. The timing was striking. It was the exact moment Heather's phone arrived at Peachtree Landing. On February 21st, 2014, police executed a search warrant at the Moorer residence. After 11 hours of searching, both Sydney and Tammy were arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of indecent exposure. The indecent exposure charges came from sexually explicit images found on their phones that they had taken of themselves in public places. The obstruction charge against Sydney stemmed from his initial denial that he had used the payphone, a claim he only retracted when confronted with the security camera footage. At a news conference, police didn't go into detail about what evidence supported the murder and kidnapping charges, but the arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The Moorers posted bond on some charges, but were initially held without bond on the murder charges. A month after the arrests, the court imposed a gag order on all participants in the case. Investigators also announced additional charges related to Medicaid fraud, saying the Moorers had failed to disclose income from their businesses on a 2007 application for benefits exceeding $10,000. In early 2015, the Moorers were released from jail after a judge accepted Tammy's mother's house as collateral for a $100,000 bond. At the bond hearing, prosecutors admitted they still had no direct evidence linking the couple to Heather's disappearance. The court required GPS monitoring and ordered the Moorers to stay 5 miles away from the Elvis family home and avoid any interaction with them on social media. What followed was a battle that extended beyond the courtroom. On social media, Tammy and Sydney had disparaged Heather as a stalker, suggesting police had framed them and were protecting the real killers. Their supporters rallied around them online, and the Elvis family felt overwhelmed trying to fight back. At one point, the Elvises held a news conference to denounce what they claimed was organized online harassment. Sydney reported to police that people had fired at him or brandished weapons while he was driving with his family, though deputies who responded to one incident saw no signs his truck had been hit. He posted signs outside the family home lamenting threats and the impact on his children. The case had become a public spectacle, with both sides claiming victimhood. In March 2016, prosecutors made a surprising move. They dropped the murder charges against both Sydney and Tammy without prejudice, meaning they could be reinstated later. The indecent exposure charges were also dropped, along with the obstruction charge against Tammy. The Elvis family said they were disappointed, but understood that prosecutors had to make difficult decisions. They hoped further investigations and trials on the outstanding charges would eventually reveal what happened to their daughter. The kidnapping charges remained, and that's where the legal battle would continue. In June 2016, Sydney went on trial for kidnapping. Over 4 days, the state presented its case. Heather's co-workers testified about the affair and their belief that she had gotten pregnant. Law enforcement specialists documented the phone and video records connecting Sydney to Heather the morning she disappeared. Bree took the stand and became upset recalling her last conversation with her roommate. After the defense rested without calling Sydney to testify, the jury deliberated for 7 hours. They were divided. 10 wanted to convict, but 2 did not. The judge declared a mistrial. During the trial, Sydney had spoken to the media, violating the gag order. The judge found him in contempt and sentenced him to 5 months in jail, though he was released after 2 for good behavior. A year later, in July 2017, Sydney was tried on the obstruction charge. The case focused again on the phone records and video evidence, and on Sydney's initial denial that he had made the payphone call. A cousin of Tammy's testified that Sidney had shown him something on his phone after the disappearance that indicated he knew more than he had told police. In a Dateline episode that aired in 2021, prosecutors revealed what that was: a photograph of Heather in which she appeared to be clearly deceased, with blood on her shirt and scratches on her face. After 3 days, Sidney was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, the maximum for the offense. His attorney said he would appeal, arguing the charge was unconstitutionally vague and that Sidney's lie hadn't seriously hindered the investigation. In April 2018, a grand jury indicted both Sidney and Tammy on a single count of conspiracy to kidnap, the first time charges had been brought that way. Commentators believed this suggested either new evidence had been found or that prosecutors were trying to pressure one of them to testify against the other. In October 2018, almost 5 years after Heather's disappearance, Tammy went on trial. The prosecution introduced the threatening text messages she had sent Heather, arguing she had been driven into a jealous rage over Heather's possible pregnancy. Shortly after the disappearance, Tammy had called Heather a psycho whore on Facebook and suggested the younger woman had been stalking her family. Sidney's mother testified that Tammy had beaten her husband severely after learning of the affair. Sexually explicit texts Tammy had sent to her own lover were introduced, prompting the defense to move for a mistrial, arguing they were prejudicial. But those texts also showed Tammy claiming the affair itself hadn't bothered her since she had taken a lover too. When Tammy took the stand, she said she'd had a nice conversation with Heather the month before her disappearance and resolved any issues. She claimed she and Sidney had an open marriage. On cross-examination, prosecutors confronted her with contradictions from her police interview. Tammy's defense had to change course when 5 of their witnesses, including her children and mother, were accused of violating a sequestration order by watching live coverage of the trial. The judge barred them from testifying. Tammy's sister Ashley testified that Sidney had gotten his tattoo in January 2012, long before meeting Heather, and that the handcuffs were only used for sexual role-playing, contradicting what she'd told police. On the stand, Tammy said she and Sidney had gone out the night of Heather's disappearance to have sex in his truck and buy a pregnancy test because they were trying to have another child. The test came back negative. She said Sidney took the call from Heather but stayed home afterward. In closing arguments, the prosecutor compared Tammy to the evil queen in Snow White, saying that when you mix jealousy, deceit, and a woman worried about someone stealing her husband, unnatural things happen. The defense argued there was no way the Moores could have made Heather disappear without a trace in the 55 minutes between the end of her cell phone activity and Tammy's text about pot stickers. After the 11-day trial, the jury convicted Tammy of both kidnapping and conspiracy following 4 hours of deliberations. She was sentenced to 30 years for each charge to run concurrently. In September 2019, Sidney was also found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 30 years. Both appealed their convictions, but in June 2023, the South Carolina Court of Appeals denied both appeals. The court held there was substantial evidence pointing to their responsibility for Heather's disappearance, that the expert testimony about Sidney's truck was properly admitted, and that the text messages didn't substantially affect Tammy's trial. The South Carolina Supreme Court later denied their requests for review. Tammy's projected release date is May 9, 2043. Sidney's is March 31, 2044. To this day, Heather Elvis has never been found. Her family continues to search for answers, to hope that somehow, someday, they'll learn what really happened to their daughter in those dark, early morning hours of December 18, 2013. The Moores maintain their innocence, though they sit in prison convicted of kidnapping a young woman who has been missing for over a decade. The case remains one of South Carolina's most haunting mysteries, a story of how jealousy and obsession can destroy lives, how secrets can consume families, and how one young woman's attempt to move forward with her life ended in a disappearance that has never been explained. Heather's car at that boat landing, her phone going silent in the wildlife refuge, the security camera footage of that truck in the night, All of it points to something terrible, but without Heather, without her body, without that final piece of evidence, the full truth remains just out of reach, lost somewhere in the darkness of that December morning. That's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe and be kind to each other.